you're going to hear a lot of opinions over the next couple of days. I don't really have a lot of opinions. My job is to measure opinions and to actually look at data. So what I'm going to do is try to provide you with a data base to consider all of the issues that you're going to be dealing with over the next little while. Yes, I'm going to be starting the morning with statistics. I will try not to make them boring. There are some that I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on because I really do think it's worth taking them on board in order to be able to have an effective conversation through the course of the next couple of days. Because what I'm going to be showing you an awful lot of is not just public opinion data, but also demographic data from a variety of sources. So these things aren't necessarily just, as I said before, opinions. They actually constitute facts. And I think a fact-based conversation is always the most productive type of conversation. I hope you agree with me on that. A special word to the students who are in the audience. This is what you get to do if you actually get through the second-year course in statistics that you're taking. So don't discount it. It's going to become more and more important, and maybe a few years from now you'll be standing here at this podium giving a very similar presentation. So pay attention to your statistics courses. A little endorsement there. So let's start with this. The old Canada is giving way to a new Canada. We have this perception of who this country is that is no longer true. Hey, there's Elliot Tepper over there. Hey, Elliot, how are you? He was one of my professors when I was in university. So we're becoming a new country. I want to start with population patterns because there's a lot of myths about population that are actually destroyed by facts. And when you take a look at it, it's pretty stark how not just Canada is changing, but the world is changing. Yes, I'll have some statistics for our friends from around the world as well. What I want to talk about is fertility and aging, how we're either making or not making new people, how long we happen to be staying around on this earth. The second point is urbanization. The single biggest migration in world history is taking place right now, and it has nothing to do with people moving from one country to another. In fact, so we're all clear on this, only 3% of the world's population lives in a country that they weren't born in. We spend a tremendous amount of time talking about a very small number of people. The bigger migration is taking place in another way. And then finally, multiculturalism. This is particularly interesting when it comes to Canada because I think if there's a country in the world that's found a way to do this very well, it's been this country. Every conference I go to like this, I was just in Halifax at the Halifax Security Forum. Some of you may have seen the article that I wrote in the Globe and Mail with John Ibbotson last weekend about this. Populism is the thing that really upsets people and gets them really going. And we feel like we're, as I said in the article, looking at a zoo animal. We don't quite understand it. People in this room don't quite understand why people are going in the direction that they are. Canada is one of the exceptions in the world in which this has been the case, that we haven't necessarily been taken over by the populist bug. And I can talk a little bit about that too. So fertility. This is the Canadian population in 1961. I'm going to explain this chart because it's worth understanding, because to look at population correctly, this is a very good way to do it visually. Up the center, the ages of the population. At the bottom, the number of people who are at that age. Red, women, blue, men. This is a population pyramid. It goes like this. A lot of kids being born. Drops off as we get closer to the top, because we all eventually do drop off the population pyramid. I hate to break it to you. But this is a healthy replacing population. You know what population looks like this today? India. Sub-Saharan Africa. This was Canada in 1961. The average number of children that a woman had during her lifetime was 4. That was the average family. 4. I want everybody now to think about their families and how many people in your family have 4 kids. That was the typical family back then. This is the Canadian population today. 2011, there's a 2016 I could show you as well. It just moves up a little bit. This is the Canadian population today. A lot fewer kids being born. The top of the chart is flattening out because we're living longer. And that big bulge in the center, that's the baby boom as it moves its way through the population pyramid. Average Birth rate now, average number of children that a Canadian woman has, 1.6. To have a replacing stable population, not getting any bigger, not getting any smaller, you need to have a birth rate of 2.1. We're half a kid short. A country that's in exactly this circumstance, in fact, they have a birth rate of about 1.4 right now, is Japan. Between now and 2050, Japan is going to lose, their population today is about 128 million people. They're going to lose 15 million people from their population. The year 2000 was the year that the European population peaked. It's been declining every year since, even with massive immigration from Africa and from the Middle East. Why? We've stopped having kids. There's a whole number of reasons for it. People usually blame the, or credit, depending on how you look at it, the arrival of the birth control pill in the 1960s, because this is when this trend started, but that's not the truth. Actually, what's really changed is two really big things. One of them is the rate of education among women, and as a result of that, the choices that they're making in their lives. So if you look at the average Canadian woman now, back in 1960, she got married when she was around 20, and she had her first kid shortly after, and she had 4, as we said before. Today, the average Canadian woman gets married around 30, and if on average has 1.6 kids, and has them very close together. There's biological realities to the window that you have available to have children, and if you take the first 10 years out because you're pursuing an education and because you're pursuing a career, you have less time available to have children. The idea of having a third kid, which is what we're not doing these days, is becoming less and less viable within the Canadian population. But this is also a global phenomena too. This is a global phenomena, not just a Canadian phenomena. So we have to get ready for a future in which we have a lot fewer young people. I'm speaking to you, recruiters. I'm speaking to you, military personnel. We're running out of young folks. And we're going to have even fewer of them going forward. You think it's a phenomena just in one part of the country? I mean, Quebec is spending a fortune on childcare. No, it's had very, very little effect. Why? Because once it gets implanted, this low fertility idea becomes implanted as a social norm, it doesn't change, it doesn't go back. It has never happened. When women have greater choice and control over their own lives, they have fewer kids. By the way, you notice that the highest fertility rates are in places like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. One of the obvious conclusions is because they have a higher Aboriginal population that's the reason. It actually isn't. It's a small contributor. The thing about the Aboriginal population is, yes, it's the fastest growing in Canada, has a higher birth rate. It's going to be for one more generation. They're going to go through exactly the same, Aboriginal Canadians are going through exactly the same changes that we're seeing in the rest of the population. So we can't count on that. And by the way, the number of Aboriginal people who actually live on a reserve in Canada, just so we're all clear on this, who are actually, under the Indian Act, declared Indian status, is about 330,000 people. That's it. Not just in Canada, though, it's around the world. So the birth rate for the world in 1960 was 4.9. Today, it's dropped by half. The UN predicts by 2050 it's going to go down to 2.3. The UN is wrong. It's going to be lower. And I'll show you why. Canada today, in 1960, as I said before, 3.9. Today, 1.6. Statistics Canada says 1.7. Again, I think they're being optimistic. I want you to take a moment, because this stuff, after a while, turns into like, random numbers and pictures and things flashing in front of your eyes. But just take a minute and look at this chart and consider what it says. This is the top 10 most populous countries in the world. The gray line is their birth rate in 1960. The red line is their birth rate today. The 10 most populous countries in the world, their birth rate has dropped by 50% in 60 years. 50%. By the way, 40% of the world's population lives in China and India, so if the UN is going to get the projections correct in terms of estimating what the global population is going to be going forward, because they tell us it's going to get to 11.1 or 2 billion by the turn of the next century, they've got to get those two countries correct, right? Okay, China at 1.7. The Chinese government doesn't even say they've got a birth rate of 1.7. Chinese government says probably somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4, and there's a lot of demographers who say that it's probably closer to 1. It's not because of the one-child family, although it accelerated the problem. Everything that's happening in Canada about the choices that women are making in their lives in China, in Canada, they're making the same choices in China as the middle class continues to grow in that country. In fact, the lowest birth rate of any Canadian immigrant group among women is among Chinese women. They're like a sugar high of immigration to Canada. It's a one-generation impact. So are they going to actually, the birth rate in China actually going to rise through this century? I'm very, very doubtful. In India, I was just in India because I've just written another book on it's going to be out in August on this topic. But the Indian demographers aren't saying that it's close to 2.5. They're saying it's probably close to replacement rate. So if you've got a probably questionable statistics going forward for China and India, that's 40% of the world's population. I'm a little doubtful that you're going to actually be able to get to 11.1 billion, or whatever the number is going to be, 11.1 billion people by 2100. It's probably going to be closer to about the size of the population that we have today. It's going to rise to maybe mid-century, and then it's going to stop, and then it's going to start to decline. And how far it declines, who knows? But most of the increase in the world's population today is not coming as a result of more people being added to the population. It's fewer people leaving. We're really bad at making new people. We're really good at keeping people around. My favorite one on this chart, by the way, is Brazil. Look at that. It's gone from 6.2 to 1.8 in the space of basically a generation. Look at Bangladesh. Everybody thinks, oh my God, Bangladesh is being overrun by people. Yes, it's a younger population, but they've stopped having kids too. Aging, and this is the other point I was making. This is the average lifespan of Canadians in 1920s, today, and by 2036, as Statistics Canada tells us. Average Canadian, you were old if you were 57. By the way, I'm turning 57 tomorrow. In the 1920s, you were old. Today, the average Canadian lives to 81. Statistics Canada tells us we're going to age till 87 by 2036, which, by the way, is the average lifespan of somebody in Japan today. We have increased the lifespan of the average Canadian in around a century by 30 years. In China, in 1950, the average lifespan of a Chinese person was 40. Today, it's 80. The median age of a Canadian today, so that means half the population is older and half the population is younger, is 41. In the 1970s, it was 24. This stuff is real, folks. Population is changing. We're not the country that we think we were. We think we are. Statistics Canada, I love this little infographic because it really points it out. Actually, back in the last few years, we've gone through a transition in which we now have more people over the age of 65 than we have under the age of 15. And that's not just us, that's most of the developed world. Starting to get where I'm going here? World population, percentage of seniors. By 2050, over a quarter of our population is going to be 65 years of age or older in Canada. In the world, it's going to be 16%. In places like China, it's going to be aging at the same pace as it is in Canada, maybe even more rapidly. China's got a really big problem. Really, really big problem. We can talk about the South China Sea all we want. They've got a really serious problem. They're going to get old before they get rich enough to be able to support their old population, which makes them in a very difficult internal demographic situation. They don't have a national pension program. They rely on their kids to take care of the elderly, and they're not having kids. In fact, you take it one step worse. It's estimated that between 30 and 60 million Chinese women are missing from the population because they were never born. Because of the one-child policy, they practice infanticide, and they have a deficit in terms of the number of women in population. Unless we can make men have babies, that's another big problem that they have. So what does this do? Well, it creates a real demographic problem for Canada. The number of people working for every person who's retired. By 2036, it's going to be it's basically 2 for 1. So you can see where all the tax dollars are going to be going. Urbanization. As I said, we're going through the biggest single transformation in where the world is living right now. In 1960, 34% of the population lived in a city. Today, it's over half. By 2050, it's going to be 2/3. It's going to be a complete reversal from where it was in 1960. So when you start thinking about who's going to be in those remote places of the world that we're protecting for our sovereignty, the answer is crickets, literally crickets. If it's warm enough to support crickets. Nobody. Everybody's moving to the city. There's a lot of benefits that go along with this, but you have to change your concept of what territory is as a result. And if you think this is Canada's the Great White North and we're all out there and experiencing Nordic sports and all that kind of thing, yeah, some of us are, but most of us aren't. In fact, 82% of the Canadian population today lives in a town that's bigger than 1,000 people. 40% of us live in 4 population centers. That's the 3 big ones plus Calgary. We're a hugely, hugely urban population in Canada. Over 90% of us live within 100 miles of the US border. So that Great White North that's north, we've never seen it. All you have to do is ask your friends, don't ask the Air Force guys or anybody in the room, when was the last time you saw the Northern Lights? I bet you for a lot of it, it's not been, if ever, in a very long time. We don't go there. We don't live there. And not only is Canada becoming a much more urbanized country, we're becoming a much more Western country. I wrote a book a couple of years ago, maybe some of you saw, called The Big Shift. And this is the whole book in a slide. And essentially what's happened is Canada is moving from being an Eastern, continentally oriented type of a country, where our eyes are cast on Europe and across the Atlantic Ocean, to becoming a country that's focused on the Pacific, because that's where our population is moving. That's becoming the Canadian Ocean now. And it's just going to keep going in that direction. And the reason is, Atlantic Canada, old, more people are dying in Atlantic Canada every day today than are being born, and no immigrants are moving there. If they do move there, they move away within 5 years. Sorry for all you people who have real estate in Atlantic Canada. You can get a great deal in Atlantic Canada right now. Yeah, so we're becoming a Western country that's more oriented towards the Pacific. And immigration's adding to that, and I'll show you why in just a second. And it continues unabated. This is population growth between 2011 and 2016. The Alberta population has gone up by almost 12% in the space of 5 years. I mean, and this is without like Syrian refugees coming across the border, or this is without, war, pestilence, famine, whatever else that you could think of. This is people just choosing to move to Alberta. Now, I know what you're going to say about oil and gas, and my God, that's depressed population movement to Alberta. It hasn't. Every month for the last 2 or 3 years, the population of Alberta has increased. What has started to decline is the population moving from different provinces to Alberta, but what's still continuing unabated is foreign immigration coming to Alberta. Look at New Brunswick in terms of population growth. Look at Nova Scotia, look at Newfoundland, look at Prince Edward Island. They have the oldest populations in the country. They have the lowest birth rates, with the exception of British Columbia, and very few immigrants are moving there. Haven't heard a lot of talk about that in politics in Canada. This is an emerging issue. Immigration, Canada's secret weapon. So our average annual population growth for the G8, Canada has every year about 1%, has the fastest growing population in the G8. Take a look at Japan. It's almost impossible to become a citizen of Japan, and no immigrants move there, which is why they're losing population. It's why, even though we have a similar birth rate, our population continues to grow. This is a result of immigration. We bring in almost 300,000 immigrants a year to Canada. The latest projection is going to be about 330,000. The truth about that, when you really calculate it, if you just look over 2 decades, that's 2 new Torontos being added to the country in the space of 2 decades. That's a lot of population change. We accept more immigrants in Canada, legally, than any other country in the world, per capita. And where do they come from? Back in 1970, it was basically all those draft dodgers and people from the UK. In fact, until the 1980s, the UK was still our #1 source of immigrants. Today, it's almost exclusively from the Pacific. Everybody thinks that China is our biggest source of immigration. Absolutely not true, not anymore. Why? Because they're running out of young people to send. And the middle class is rising in China, so there's less reason to move. Who's coming here overwhelmingly? People from the Philippines. Fastest growing language in Canada? Tagalog. I wonder how much recruiting information we have in Tagalog. And now I'm starting to make you feel uncomfortable. Sorry about that. But they're all moving to some very specific places. They're not moving to Newfoundland. The foreign-born population of Newfoundland is 1.8%. Almost none. It's a rounding error. But look at Ontario, look at British Columbia, look at Alberta. The reason that the population in Western Canada, particularly Manitoba and Saskatchewan, has turned around is because of immigration. And immigrants don't move to the country, they move to the city. In fact, they move to our largest city. Immigrants, 91% move to one of our major cities. So you're not going to repopulate the Miramichi with immigrants unless you change our immigration policy. And if you think that, Toronto seems a little multicultural, it's the most multicultural city in the world. By the way, for my English friends, London's 40%. Toronto's 50%. Now think about that. Standing in Yonge Dundas Square in downtown Toronto, turn around in a circle. Every second person who walks by you was born in another country. You see why Ottawa is not such a great representation for the rest of the country? You can't say the same thing about this place. In fact, the foreign-born population of Ottawa is about 18%. But even more than New York City, which we think is the great multicultural city in the world, Toronto's almost twice the amount of foreign-born population. So what about the military? So let me throw in, now that we've established a demographic basis for what the country is becoming and what the world is becoming, what do we know about what people think about military issues? Now this looks like spaghetti, I know. But every month we ask what's the most important issue facing the country, the one that we care the most about. I'd invite you to read down the side there instead of trying to follow all the lines. Everything is basically a domestic issue. The only issue that really pops as being any sort of a defense-related issue is something related to terrorism, which has both a home aspect and an away aspect. The thing that really concerns Canadians is the home aspect. But I also did some research for the Halifax Security Institute, Halifax Security Forum, in which we asked Canadians, okay, well, if you're not concerned every day about defense issues, what do you think the biggest threats facing the world? The ones that, that kept you up at night, what are you really concerned about? Number one, you can see on this chart, being hacked by either a foreign power or a criminal organization. A terrorist attack in your country, followed by a nuclear or chemical attack in the world, a major natural disaster, violent conflict breaking out between ethnic groups in your country. For some strange reason, Canadians, half of us are concerned about that. I don't know why. Your country entering into an armed conflict with another country, the thing that we're most prepared for. Pretty far down the list. Followed by a major health epidemic, followed by your personal safety. We actually personally feel quite safe in our cities and our towns around the country. That's not the same if you go to a place like, for example, Latin America. So, how well prepared is your government for dealing with this? We're really well prepared for dealing with health epidemics. In fact, maybe even a little over-prepared in the minds of Canadians. But hacking, not prepared at all. Big gap between what Canadians fear and how well prepared they think their governments are for defending what they perceive as the biggest threat that they're most concerned about. But should we even be engaged in the world? I mean, we have a lot of economic problems. Should we really be more focused on what's happening at home? 74% of Canadians say that we should. 80% of Americans say, you know what, we shouldn't be so focused on the world, we should really be focused on what's happening at home. But an interesting contradiction when you start to play this out a little bit. Okay, so you're really concerned about a domestic agenda. But do we have a responsibility to be a moral leader in the world? Absolutely. In fact, Canada, almost as much as the US, which pretty much leads the world, feels that it has a moral responsibility to be engaged in the world. So yes, we want to make sure things are taken care of at home, but we're not putting hermetically sealing ourselves from what happens in the world. We feel that we need to be out there as well. By the way, I'll leave these charts with the CDA folks so all of our people, our friends from other countries, can see where your countries rank on this, because I asked it in 26 countries. And when we ask people around the world who they think could play a positive role in the world, number one on the list, and this is 18,500 people that we interviewed, Canada. Now, I'm sure you've seen these data because people have been tweeting them out all over the place, but Canada ranks very high in terms of world esteem. So yes, we think we should be more focused on our country. We do believe that we have a moral responsibility, and the world wants to see us be involved in world issues. But do we think economic power or military power is more important? We actually think economic power is more important. So it's not just about military intervention, it's also about a question of being involved in trade, international trade. By the way, the world does support free trade, so we're aware of that. There's some populous countries that have some more problems with it, but most of the world supports free trade. And given that the world is a dangerous place, should we be spending more on our military? 63% of Canadians believe that we should. So, domestic concerns, but we also feel that there's an international game that we need to be involved in. And we need a military to do it. And by the way, just so everybody knows this, it's a little hard to see this on this chart, but every year I go out and do an evaluation of every profession in Canada and ask them, do you trust these people? And I always hear this whining from the people in the military, oh, you know, nobody likes us. No, you're among the most trusted professionals in the country, right up there with airline pilots. Now, that's a dangerous thought, knowing some of my military friends, but a very, very trusted profession, a very credible profession, a profession that can talk about safety and military issues with a lot of credibility to the Canadian public, and they rely on your expertise to tell them what's best. You're an extremely trusted group of individuals in this country at the level of first responders, and interestingly enough, it has been rising. In fact, if I took this timeline back to when I first started doing this back in the mid-aughts, it's gone up about 14 or 15 points, and it's the only profession in the country that has. So the military is in a good place. So what does this all mean for you? Let's finish this off and then we'll take some questions. First of all, we're changing. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, but it's an important thing. Next, remote sovereignty. What is that going to be in terms of the Canadian North when there's almost nobody living there and fewer people living there? What are we going to do about protecting our sovereignty in those places? Because you may not be able to do it with people. Well, we're really not doing it that much with people now, but it's going to be even less in the future. Next, we're living longer, we're living healthier. We need to redefine work and retirement and recruiting. Why does it always have to be young people that do this? because we're not going to have enough. In fact, certain analysts are arguing that we're set up for a geriatric peace. We're too old to fight. Now, it's going to take some time to get there, and maybe we'll find a way of replacing young people with technology, but these are the realities. So for example, I know the Chief of Defense Staff, John Vance, has said, we have to start thinking about different ways of who's going to be in the reserves, who's going to be staffing the Canadian Forces, because, quite frankly, if we're relying on young people to do all of these things, we're running out of them. And not only that, when you look at the threats that people are really concerned about, for example, cyber, they don't really require people jumping out of airplanes to be able to deal with it. So what are we going to do in terms of rethinking what our military is going to be staffed with? And by the way, this just isn't a Canadian problem, this is a global problem. Or not problem, challenge. Next, an increasing Pacific connection. I know our Navy friends are all applauding, but it's the truth. Why? Because that's where our population is moving to, and it's also where our new Canadians are moving from. They feel a connection to those places. There's going to be an increasing focus on Pacific issues and nations as we move forward in this era. There's no decline in respect for the military, so please get off that hobby horse. It's just not true. The immediate issues agenda is a domestic agenda, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people want to be disengaged with the world. Nonetheless, Canadians want to be present in the world, provide moral leadership, and they see the military as being part of this. We are unprepared for our biggest threats, which are basically related to cyber and domestic terrorism. We need to adjust our thinking to the new realities in Canada and the world, and that's basically what I hope I've given you enough information now to start thinking about. Thank you very much.